How's it going, Ping Pirates crew? It's Adrian here, and we're back with another video. So for those of you that don't know, last week we had a regionals from the top cut, and it was just completely taken over by WHITEBEARD, and overall in the regionals, they just had 23 top 16 placements, even beating out Zoro in terms of representation. So because of this, I think you're going to be seeing this a lot in your locals. I think you're going to be seeing it a lot in terms of the big tournaments like the Treasure Cups or regionals. So I wanted to just go over what makes this deck so strong, what we can kind of do to, in general, fight it. And I'm going to be going over what cards specifically, each deck archetype has to deal with its threats. But with that being said, let's get right into the video, starting with a quick refresher for what the leader skill does. To put it simply, WHITEBEARD has the worst leader skill in the game, with at the end of your turn, you are going to take the top life card and draw it. What this means is that after every one of your turns, you are going to take 1 damage. But this is counterbalanced kind of by the fact that WHITEBEARD is a 6,000 power leader, which is 1k above every other leader. Regular leaders can't swing 5k at him. They have to attach a Dawn to even attempt to swing at him, which is changing the math completely of this game, right? And he also starts at 6 life. So what this means is that even though you're taking a life every turn, you're still drawing a bunch of cards, right? Because with 6 life, you have 6 cards to draw from. It's basically like a second hand to you. And because they're at 6,000 power, it's a lot easier to counter out of so many attacks, right? Usually the magic number is 7,000, but if someone's swinging at you 7,000, you just counter out with a 2k, and they've wasted so much Dawn usually, or a big attacker. And because they're drawing from their life every turn, they're going to have such a big hand for you to face down. So it could honestly feel very frustrating to play against WHITEBEARD sometimes because they have these huge hands to counter. And then also on top of that, you have to swing more at them for them to counter out of anyway. And it just changes up the whole math and interactions with the game. So I think you guys know the drill by now. We're going to be going over what makes WHITEBEARD so strong, starting off with pretty much everything I just mentioned before. He's at 6,000 power and 6 life. He's going to draw a bunch of cards. You need to swing 6k at him. It's going to be easier for him to counter. So that's just going to be super strong and incredibly frustrating to deal with. On top of that, this is one of the most consistent decks that we've ever seen in the history of the game, right? You're basically drawing 2 cards per turn between your life and your deck. And on top of that, you're running a bunch of Straw Hat cards. So Nami is going to search out all of your threats, like 4 cost Luffy and Frankie. They could search your endgame threats, like 5 cost Luffy, that could just punch through a bunch of blockers. And then also, she's searching your event cards, so she's searching your defenses, right? Guard Point and Radical Beam are important pieces to the puzzle, in your late game, right? If you don't draw into them, you're probably just going to die. So you're drawing a bunch of cards from your life in your deck, and then also you're seeing a bunch of the cards you want to see because of Nami. This deck also just has amazing mid and late game board presence. You could play a lot of your characters and swing into them because they're going to be 6k, 7k attackers. Also, it's a lot harder for your opponent to stick things on board because if it's a huge threat like Okiku, you could always just attach 1 Dawn onto him, swing 7k, and it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to counter out of all of these 7k swings or 6k swings. And most of the time, they're just going to have to let these cards go instead of sticking onto the board. And of course, if things aren't sticking onto the board, they're less of a threat to you, right? And then, of course, you have to worry about these big vanillas that are on the board, but you also have to worry about the rush cards that they have access to in their hand. Because at any point, they could just, play a Luffy or play an Ace, just completely ruin your turn or completely ruin, your plan of countering. So they have to be, it's something that you have to constantly think about throughout the game. And just when you're evaluating, should I save this card? How many swings do they have for game? You have to always be thinking about, they have a rush card that they can play on me, and it's a big bodied rush card, right? Luffy is a 6k, Ace is a 7k, and especially with Luffy, he could punch through blockers, so a lot of the time, you could get caught off guard if you're not thinking about it, because you'll be at 1 or 0 life. You might take because you think you're safe, and then Luffy will just punch through all like all the blockers that you've set up in the turns. And then I got into this a little bit before, but this deck is actually very frustrating in how survivable it is. You would think a deck that takes 1 damage every single turn at the end of their turn would be, you know, like dead so fast, but that's not the case, because you still have to land that last hit at 0 life, which is going to be very difficult because they have access to those 1 cost event cards that just pump them up by 4,000. Guard point's going to pump them up by 3,000, and it matters so much more into Whitebeard because they have that extra 1,000 power. So even your biggest swings are like, they could be dealt with 1 card, right? You have to swing 10k just to get 2 cards out of them if they have Radical Beam. If you're swinging 9k, they could just Radical Beam out with and go up to 10. It's incredibly frustrating. And also on top of that, they're drawing a bunch of cards, so they're going to have 2Ks and 1Ks in hand to deal with all of your other stuff. And while you're busy trying to kill them, they're killing you even faster because he's, you know, attaching 1 Dawn, swinging at you 7k, and it's a lot harder to block for you because his 1 Dawn swing takes 2 cards out of your hand if you want to counter out of it. And a lot of the time, because of this in the late game, it could feel really hopeless. He's going to have a lot of characters on board and also just a ton of cards in hand to counter out with. And we're going to be going over those strategies on how to kind of minimize these things. But let's first get into what cards you need to look out for and what you can do to kind of play around them. So the most common thing that's going to be on a Whitebeard player's board is just these big vanillas. The most common ones you're going to see are the 4 costs Frankie and Luffy, because they could be searched out by Nami. They're played in Strawbeard. Some lists run the Kingdu just in case they go like first, and playing a 5-drop 7k on curve is just great for Whitebeard players. So this is like one of the most common plays you're going to see from them as well. It's kind of flip-floppy between the two. Some of them, you know, the hybrid lists also run Atmos, which is just another 4-drop 6k. It just has the Whitebeard tag instead. So there's not a lot of counterplay to this. I mean, they're just big stat sticks, you know, big vanillas. But I will say, you want to be swinging at board, especially if it's Luffy or Frankie rested. And this is because it's pretty much exactly like swinging at the Whitebeard leader, except you don't want him to build a gigantic board of like 6Ks and 7Ks that he could just swing at you with. You want him to get rid of cards out of his hand or lose the character. Because one of the best situations to be in is like just removing these characters off the board, especially after he's like countered 1k or countered even 2k, just to protect the things on board. Because a Whitebeard player with no board is not that threatening, right? Because, you know, he could play the rush cards and everything, but as long as you have blockers and a reasonable amount of counters in hand, you could kind of deal with its aggression. It's really that this board, and if you let it pile up, and if you let him get like 2 or 3 of these on board, that's his win condition. Because then he'll have like 2 or 3 of these huge swings, and then also on top of that, he could still rush you down with like a Luffy or an Ace. So make sure that, especially if Frankie and Luffy are on board, if they play the Kingdu and it's rested, it's a little bit harder to swing at because 7k is a very tall order. But what I say, a general rule for me is, if it's Luffy or Frankie rested, I'm always swinging into it. If it's something like a Kingdu rested, I would rather swing at Luffy or Frankie, or just at the Whitebeard leader if Kingdu's the only thing on board. So we've been talking about these pretty much all video, but these cards really give Whitebeard a big edge towards like the end game, and just like because they're rush in general. We have 5-cost Luffy, which we know from OP1 and Zoro players. He's a 5-cost 6k that has rush, and then on top of that, if he has 2 Dawn under him, he cannot be blocked. So you can't use blockers, you have to straight up use counters on whatever he's swinging at. And this is especially scary in like the late game, when you're at like 1 or 2 life and you're kind of weighing out all your options, right? Because between blockers and counters, like you have to be thinking, you know, is it worth it to block here? And a lot of the times, like you might take an extra hit that you shouldn't have because they have the option to play Monkey D. Luffy. And I've definitely lost games because I wasn't conscious of this card. And in general, like One Piece is all about, you know, playing out the scenario in your head to make your decisions. But if you're not keeping this card in mind, it's going to surprise you and you're going to have to react to it on the spot, which means that you might not make the best decision in the moment. So especially if you're defending, for your life, you always want to keep this card in mind. Another rush card that is great in this deck is going to be Ace. He's a 7-drop 7k, and he has the on-play effect of giving 2 things minus 3k, and then since you're playing Whitebeard, he actually gains Rush. And this is just a great all-around card, right? Because he has Rush, you could be super aggressive with him, just, swing face or swing at board, and then your opponent's going to have a lot of trouble getting rid of him since he's at that 7k. He gets insane value the turn he's played because he's giving 2 things minus 3000, which can activate some removal effects, right? If you already have like a 9-cost Whitebeard, for example, that Whitebeard effect is now KOing something that's 6k. And even if you're not activating something like a KO effect, just dropping something down to 3000 is super important, especially since you could do it on something like a blocker, like 7-drop Kid, right? Because they're going to be a lot more hesitant to block with a 4000 power than a 7000 power that they could counter out of. And another card that you need to constantly be worrying about, especially in the mid game, is the 9-cost Edward Newgate. He's a 9-cost 10k with the on-play effect of your leader is going to gain plus 2000 power, and then on top of that, you cannot take life due to a card effect. And that effect is super important because a lot of players will tell you, 100% prioritize the board always. The Whitebeard player is taking life every turn. That means you don't have to hit him for life. But in this variant, you actually have to balance the two because you don't want them to have this safe 9-cost play. Because the absolute nightmare scenario is you haven't successfully hit them for life by the time they get to 9 or 10 Dawn, and then they drop this, they go up to 8000 power on your turn, and then also they have 2 life left, which means that there's no chance of you going for game, right? And also, this puts you on a clock. When they play this card, if you can't remove it through some removal with black or some pistol shenanigans playing red, you're probably just going to lose the game in 1 or 2 turns because he's swinging at you for 10k every turn. And then on top of that, his effect is when he has 2 Dawn under him, he's going to KO one of your characters that has a power of 3000 or less. So he has Robin effect, but Robin effect on a 10k body is huge. So this is a card you always want to be thinking about because the absolute best case scenario for you is you've swung at him so much that this card is never safe and it's just a dead card in his hand. And especially since a lot of the Strawbeard players are playing 3, even 4 of this card, if there are multiples in his hand that he can't play and they're not counters, this is a huge upside for you. So we just spent a lot of time talking about all the strengths of Whitebeard and why this deck thrives, but now we're going to ask ourselves, what can we do about this? As a player, what can I do to minimize the amount of damage that this Whitebeard player is doing to me and kind of put the game in my hands? The first point might be a little bit controversial, but I do think swinging early at their life is very, very important because, and a lot of people will disagree because, I'm swinging at the Whitebeard player's hand. All it's doing is giving him more cards to work with, giving him a bigger hand. But honestly, this deck is so different from all the other decks in that he's going to see that hand. He's going to have a big hand throughout the whole game. And that's just how it is because he's seeing his life every single turn. He's going to take that damage anyway. So the thing that you need to do as the player is drop him down to 0 life fast. And if you're swinging at their life, and especially if they're taking, this does 2 things. 1, it puts them on a timer so that once they're at 0 life, they actually have no form of card advantage other than drawing from the top of their deck. So let's say that you drop the Whitebeard player down to 0 life, and then they have 10 cards in hand. You only need to worry about 10 cards now because the Whitebeard player is only going to lose cards in terms of playing them and countering out of your attacks. So it gives you less and less to worry about as the turns go on. And the earlier that you could get them in that state, the better. Also, it's going to make their 9-cost play a lot harder to do, right? Because if they're at 1 life, and especially if they're at 0 life, playing that 9 cost is extremely risky because you won't have the Dawn to run like 1 or 2 counter events. And then also on top of that, it might just eat cards out of their hand anyway because of this. So they're going to have a very risky 9-cost play, especially on 0 life. And you might just make it a completely obsolete card in the late game, which is super important because every card matters against this deck. And then also, especially since every card matters, I would use your 2k counters for 6k swings, especially in the early game. And this also kind of goes against what we know, right? Usually you would want to take life early because you want more cards out of your hand. But unless you're looking for like a specific card, I would counter out of those 6k swings, because later on in the game when you're getting swung out for like 7k, 9k, like 10k, it's going to be a lot harder for you to not take life. So preserving that life to the late game is very, very important. I've won a lot of games because I simply just had like, by the time that the WHITEBEARD player had 0 life, I had like 4 or even 5 life. And that makes their decisions a lot harder, right? Because they might start to ignore your board because they have to swing at your character. And that makes it easier for you to take control of the game, since they're not going to be swinging at your characters. They have to now swing at your life. So if a WHITEBEARD player gives you like a free 6k swing, I would counter out of it, especially in the early game, because it's just going to be so difficult to counter out of things in the late game. And you're going to be glad that you preserved like so much life to deal with their threats in the late game. And then also just always be ready for those rush cards. I went into it a lot earlier, so I won't say a lot about it now, but always keep them in mind, especially the Luffy, because Luffy could steal games from you. Ace is more of like a board control type card. Like, just always be mindful of the possibility of him being played, because what WHITEBEARD players could also do is just bait you into thinking that you're like countering out of an important character, and then they'll just drop it by 3000 and then swing into it anyway, you know, leaving you kind of defenseless. So please just always be mindful that they exist and that they are possible plays that the WHITEBEARD player can do. This is especially for the mid game, but really try to balance your swings between face and board. And what I mean by this is, you know, especially if you're nearing the late game before like the 9-cost play, it might be more valuable to swing at their life instead of their board, because, you know, you could try and control the board all you want, right? But if they have like this 9-cost play lined up, you want to pressure them and make them use cards out of their hands so that the 9-cost play isn't safe. Because let's say that I'm like choosing to swing at board and they just counter out of all of it, or even they can just let their characters die. They have the amazing 9-cost play and they're at 2 life. Now the game just got extremely more difficult for me. So this is more of a thing like before the turn before they can play the 9-cost WHITEBEARD. Just weigh out whether it'll be better to swing at one character or whether it'll just be better to swing at their leader in general and get ready and drop them down to like 1 or 2 life before they play the WHITEBEARD. And then also, this is like a minor kind of mistake that I've seen a lot of players do, but do not swing big when the WHITEBEARD player has a low amount of cards in their hand. So I've seen a lot of mistakes by, you know, swinging like, you know, 7k or even 8k when the WHITEBEARD player will have like 3 or 4 cards in hand. At that point, it's just way better to swing like 6k in a lot of cases, especially if you have like a really wide board, because the WHITEBEARD player is going to be at 0 life, right? If their hand is full of counter events, it doesn't really matter if you swing 6k because they're going to have to rest it and use it. And I see this a lot where like they'll swing like 7k and then they'll rest for an event, and then they'll go and swing like 9k or something, which I don't really agree with, because you already saw that they countered out of a 7k swing with a full-on counter event. So at that point, you should just swing 6k, try to go as wide as you can, waste as many cards as possible, and then do like one big swing at the end when they have like 1 or 2 cards in hand. And this is just going to be general rules to follow to kind of just play around WHITEBEARD in general. But if I missed anything, let me know down below so that we could kind of get like a thread going if you have a great tip that you've kind of found like finds you success in this matchup. But with that being said, let's get into a more specific topic with going through kind of all the colors and deck archetypes and talking about what cards specifically you have that can deal with these Whitebeard threats. Honestly, for Zoro, it's going to be very, very tough for you because Zoro is all about swinging, like 5k and just being very aggressive. But that's a lot harder when Whitebeard players can just counter out 1k out of like a 6k swing, because that does two things for you, right? You have to allocate more Dawn throughout a turn to swing at 6k, and also it's going to be way easier for them to counter out of it. And then on top of that, if they manage to get the 9 cost down, you pretty much can't stick anything on board anymore because of how low power your cards are. But of course, some great cards to deal with this is always the Jet Pistol, right? If you can trigger Jet Pistol like a Frankie or a Luffy, that is huge. Removing a threat like that is amazing. Also, like the power-up cards, with Makino are going to pair really well with your Sunnykun, because, Makino is going to increase the power of a Sunnykun to 6k, plus Zoro Leader is going to increase it to 7k. And then if you attach a Dawn under him, he's swinging for 8k now, which means that now your Sunnykun demands 2 cards. And then on top of that, Makino is something that the Whitebeard player has to swing at. So she kind of acts like a pseudo blocker, which is going to help you live to the late game. And then there's also great cards like Brook, which he will attach 2 Rested Dawn under one of your characters or your leader so that you could swing bigger. And then now you have a 3k on board for next turn to keep going wide and keep swinging, right? Because with this matchup, you kind of don't really care about your 2k counters as much, because the Whitebeard player is going to always be swinging at you like 6k or even 7k. So, burning cards instead of playing them is going to be really detrimental to you, since that, if your whole thing is about being aggressive, and if you don't have the cards to do that, and you kind of can't recoup the amount of cards that you have, then you're just going to lose to the Whitebeard player in the late game anyway. So green actually has a lot of tools to deal with Whitebeard, starting out with Odin. This card is amazing into this matchup because he's an 8 cost, 8,000 power, which means that just him alone is demanding 2 cards out of the Whitebeard player's hand if they don't want to use a counter event. And then he also has the added effect of being able to restand himself for 3 Dawn. And then even if the Whitebeard player manages to get rid of this card, like through some removal or just swinging into it, you get a free like Okiku to play aggressively on your next turn. And him just being on the field is such a huge threat because his restand ability lets him double swing. So you could demand the Whitebeard player block 15k twice, which is absolutely absurd. That is 10,000 power for each swing, so a total of 20,000 power that the Whitebeard player needs to counter out of if they want to live, if they're like on 0 life, which is completely absurd. And even in, scenarios where the Whitebeard player isn't at 0 life yet, he's great at, pushing for that life, or even just controlling the board since he's at a higher stat line than most of the Whitebeard cards are. On top of that, we also have blockers that we can use, like 7-drop Kid and 5-drop Law. These are blockers that, the 9 cost Whitebeard cannot pop immediately. So it's going to be very important that you have these established before that card comes down, especially the 7 cost Kid, because again, you attach 1 Dawn onto him and all of a sudden he's demanding 2 cards out of the Whitebeard player's hands, being at 8k, and then he could also be used as a blocker on your next turn. That is like the ultimate card against kind of Whitebeard player, right? Because you have a card that could swing aggressively on your turn and that could still save your life on their turn. And then also X-Drake makes a return. In OP1, you rarely saw this card played over Killer, especially like in the later half of the OP1 lifespan, because Killer was just a more efficient card. There wasn't a lot of things that X-Drake was hitting that mattered, right? The only things were Dofi. But in this format, you are now hitting things like 4-drop Monkey D. Luffy, 4-drop Frankie, and just being able to instantly wipe a character from the Whitebeard player's board. On top of that, he's a 6k, which means he could attack the next turn he's played, is super important. And there's a lot of tricky plays you could do, like getting cards out of your opponent's hand by swinging into something like the 6k Frankie or the 6k Luffy, and then just dropping this X-Drake on the board so they lose the character anyway. And then of course, green also has the added effect of just being able to rest a bunch of the character cards. Okiku is especially going to be very oppressive into the early game boards where, you know, the only thing they can play are those Frankies and Luffys. Punk Gibson is going to be a really great option in terms of countering events because it's going to bring you up to 9,000, and on top of that you could rest something like the Frankie, like the Luffy. It's just such a great event card in terms of like this matchup. And then of course you have the other resters with Izo, which is probably going to be played less unless you're playing the 5-cost Law. But then you also have Yamato, which is really great because she's at that 6,000 power, which is that magic number against Whitebeard players. Moving on to blue, we have great removal effects like Arabesque Fist, which is going to bounce a 4-cost or less back to your opponent's hand, which means that you're going to be getting rid of those 4-cost 6Ks. Monkey D. Luffy can also do this on play and when attacking. So Luffy is this great card that turns very aggressive because, you know, when you do use his effect, he gains double attack. So on play, you could use it defensively to remove something, and then you could also use it when he's attacking. So you effectively get 2 bounces out of this card if he sticks. And then also just being like, I didn't add these on, but just being like an Ivankov player, running that leader skill is really great because you could counter out in the early game without sacrificing a lot of your late game, right? Because you're going to want to be at a low card count anyway. So you countering out like in the early game, kind of surviving those hits so that you can chain your Ivankovs over and over again is going to be really important, because if you have like so many 7Ks, and especially if you're summoning the double attack Luffy, it's going to be very dangerous for the Whitebeard player, and it's going to demand a lot of cards out of their hand to counter out of it, right? Because Whitebeard players love cards, but they do not want to eat a double attack from Monkey D. Luffy. And then, of course, moving on to black, pretty much all forms of your removal are going to be great. Kobe is great because he's going to KO a 3-cost or less, but you could always reduce their cost with, you know, Smoker Leader or Suru or Helmeppo, so that's not like really a problem for you. 6 costs, Sakazuki is always just going to be able to KO like a Kingdu or a, you know, a Frankie off the bat. If you cost reduce something, you could even KO things like Ace. And then, of course, you got 10-cost Kuzan, which is going to help you throughout the game, especially in the late game, because he's going to pop something that costs 5 or less on play. And then for the rest of the time he's on the board on your turn, he's going to neg everything by 5. So you could even potentially pop stuff like 9-cost Whitebeard if they ever play it. But you also want to be very careful using these effects, right? Because most of them, like Kobe and Sakazuki, require you to discard a card, and every card matters into the Whitebeard matchup. There's a lot of games that are really down to the wire where you need like exact counter. So just be careful when you're using these effects. Make sure you're using them in pivotal moments where like it actually matters, and not moments where like they could just replace it with something else, right? Especially Kobe, because Kobe doesn't have a lot of board presence after you play him. Sakazuki, you could be a little more loose with because at least you get a 7k on board as well. But like especially those Kobes, like they can just eat cards out of your hand, and then on board like you have to attach 2 Dawn to even swing against the Whitebeard, which can be very detrimental to your turns. So I think you guys are seeing a common theme by now, but a lot of the deck's best cards are going to be those removal cards, starting off with purple with King. King on play is just going to KO something that is 4 or less, which means the Frankie and the Luffy. Kaido can KO something that costs 5 or less, which is the same cards, plus something like a Kingdu. But on top of that, he gains Rush and he's a 10k, which means that, you know, he's usually taking 2 things out on the board, and then you're left with this 10k beat stick that can swing every turn. Even Whitebeard players are going to have a hard time dealing with this Kaido unless they already have like a new gate on board, which is pretty unlikely, because if you have the Onigashima, then it's going to be very easy for you to get this out really early. And if you're countering very early against the Whitebeard, you are going to have like a safe turn to play this. And these cards are super important because they do pretty much two things you will always want to do against a Whitebeard player, which is remove their board or control their board, and also have big beat sticks that you could swing with since they're at 6 power. So these cards are awesome because you don't have to discard a card to use their removal effects. It's just Dawn that you're going to get back eventually, and then what you're left with is a big beat stick that you could swing with after you've already removed something off their board. And then also on top of that, you have cards like Hell's Judgment, which are great because it's going to pretty much prevent 2 swings, and if it doesn't prevent that second swing, it's going to make it a lot more difficult to use a second swing since you have to allocate Dawn after it. For those of you that don't know, Hell's Judgment is a new OP2 event that gives 2 things minus 3,000 power when you spend 2 Dawn and then return 1 Dawn. And this is awesome, and the applications are so good in this because if the Whitebeard player is able to go wide, you can just negate some of their attacks, and then these are able to be searched with things like Hannibal, which makes it even better in the late game, and it's just an insane card for this matchup. And then of course in the mirror match, into any matchup you always want to go second, but it's especially important in the mirror match because your curve is meant to go second, right? You're running the 4 cost 6Ks, which is super important, and you being able to get that 4 cost out a turn earlier than your opponent is extremely important because it puts you ahead of them by a large margin. And you know, most mirror matches are mostly about board control and just controlling your opponent's hand size in terms of card advantage, because you're both going to be taking 1 life anyway, so you might as well be trying to control the board and not giving your opponent that many cards. Also, on top of that, you're going to want to mulligan for your big threats like, you know, your 4 costs, your aces, and you're going to want to get rid of any 9 cost Whitebeard hands, especially if you don't have any other thing playable. 9 cost Whitebeard in the mirror is pretty much unplayable since you're losing life every turn, and then on top of that, since you're both at 6k power, like the chances of you not getting hit before the 9 cost comes out is super low, so it's usually never a safe play to Whitebeard 9 cost. Like, you have to be in, your opponent has to draw like so badly, and then even on top of that, they could just, even if they don't draw anything, they could just swing into you anyway, and you're gonna have to be forced to take that life or give a ton of cards just to play the Whitebeard 9 cost, which is like not worth it at all. On the contrary, probably one of the most important cards in this matchup is going to be that ace, because giving 2 things minus 3,000 is going to let you control the board so much better, and it's also going to like let you just rip cards out of your opponent's hand if it's on, just to keep that board presence up, right? So I would always use ace to swing at board unless you have absolutely nothing to swing at, because he's so great at just controlling the board and demanding cards out of your opponent's hand if they don't want to be behind. So that's going to be the end of this video today, guys, but if you think I missed anything, or if you have a helpful tip to use in this matchup, make sure to comment it down below, you know, have a discussion about it. Always play nice. You guys are always great at being educational and being uplifting, so that's awesome. Also, we are almost at 1,000 subscribers, which is super exciting, so if you guys could like, comment, and subscribe as usual for more content, that'd be great. And as always, no matter what you're doing in life, if you're in school, if you're working, just have a great time. I hope you're doing well in it, and I hope everyone gets into the treasure cups today and the sign up. So, you know, good luck with that, and I'll see you on the next one.